Hello. In the T-SQL query language of SQL Server, you can use different aggregate functions to perform calculations on numerical data. In this tutorial, we are going to explain what aggregate functions are and how you can use them. So, what is an aggregate function? An aggregate function performs some calculation like sum or average on a set of values, and it returns a single value. For example, if you have salaries of many employees, you can perform some calculations or functions like average, minimum, maximum, etc. So let's illustrate how we can calculate some aggregate functions in a select statement. As you can see here, we have the sample database AdventureWorks, and you can install it on your machine and execute the queries that I'm going to show you. So this is SQL Server 2019, and this is the AdventureWorks sample database. So if I expand the AdventureWorks database here, tables, let's look for some table that has some sales, like amount sales in it. Let's try this one. So as you can see here, we have, for example, the subtotal, we have the tax amount, and we have the total due. So let's try to calculate the minimum, maximum, average, and total of this column in the table sales header detail, sales order header. So here, if I remove these columns from the select statement and I put here select average, of this column total due as average amount. Let's run this. As you can see, the average total due is 3,915.99. So if I do the same, if I copy this line and I do the same for the for some other aggregate functions, for example, let's do this as the minimum, and same thing for the maximum, and same thing for the sum. So if I run this again, I forgot the comma here, so comma. So as you can see, this is the average amount for this column, this is the minimum amount, this is the maximum amount, and this is the sum. So it's pretty straightforward. And as you can see, each one of these aggregate functions returns one value: an average, a maximum, a minimum, or a sum. And you have to bear in mind that aggregate functions like these require the column to be a numerical value. If the column has another data type, it's going to give you an error. So for example, if we give the sum function here, if we give it the due date, for example, no, not due date. Let's give it status. So if I give the sum function the status, it looks like it worked with the status, because status is of type tiny int, so it can be calculated. Let's try comment. So if I give it the comment column, it's going to give me an error. It says invalid for sum operator, because it's, as you can see, comment here is a varchar. So you get the idea. The column that you apply an aggregate function to has to be numerical. There are aggregate functions that do not require the column to be numerical. For example, the count aggregate function. You can use count with any column in order to count the number of items in the column. For example, if I do here count total do as count rows, and I run this, it's going to give me 31,465 rows, which means there is this number of rows in this table. Aggregate values or functions ignore null values with the exception of count star. So if you do average or minimum or maximum or sum, these functions are going to ignore any null values in this column. Even if you do a count and then the column name, it's going to ignore null values, except if you put star. If you put star, the null values are going to be counted. As you can see here, when I removed the column name and I put star, the number of rows remained the same because there are no null values in this column. You can use expressions with aggregate functions. For example, here you can do sum of this amount times or multiply by some conversion factor, for example 1.2, and it's going to work. So you can use aggregate functions in expressions, and the result of the expression has to be numeric, of course, except for the count function. You can also use the keyword distinct to perform aggregate functions on only distinct values of the concerned column. For example, here, as you can see, I have this average amount, which is 3,915. If I do average of distinct total do, let's see if the average remains the same. As you can see, it has changed, because this is going to calculate the average only for the distinct values of the total do column. Out of the top of my head, I don't see a scenario where you will need to use the average function like this, but you need to understand the difference with and without the distinct keyword. Now let's go back to the sales order header table. Let's show the table again, and let's say we want to group the aggregate functions, for example, by customer ID, which means that we want to calculate the average, the minimum, the maximum, etc. only for values of the same customer, for example, or for example same salesperson ID or territory ID or something like that. So how would we do that? The way to do this is to do, after the from clause, to add the clause group by, and then the column we want to group by, which is in this case the customer ID. So let's try that. As you can see here, we have many rows. We don't have only one row, and the reason for this is that we have a row for each customer, but we don't see the customer here. So in order to see the customer, we can add it like this, and let's run the command again, and now you see the average, the minimum, the maximum, and the sum per customer, and we even have the number of rows. For example, for this customer we have 3 rows, for this customer we have 1 row, for this customer we have 16 rows, and so on and so forth. So as you can see clearly, now with this syntax, these aggregate functions are going to be calculating the average, the minimum, the maximum, and the sum of this column total do per customer. Okay, so this has been aggregate functions in SQL Server. Thank you for watching.